Fill to capacity. Crazy good stories and timely topics. Podcast for people too stubborn to quit and too creative not to make a difference. Inspiring, irreverent, and informative. Stay tuned. Hi, I'm Pat Benincasa, and welcome to Fill to Capacity. Today's episode is When Stories Take Flight, and my guest is Mick Cochrane, writer, poet, storyteller, and professor. Let me start with a bio. Mick is born and raised in St. Paul, Minnesota. He played baseball and loved the Minnesota Twins. He got his undergraduate degree in English from University of St. Thomas, a PhD in English literature from University of Minnesota. Now, his first novel, Flesh Wounds, was published by Doubleday and was a finalist in the Barnes & Noble Discover Great New Writers competition. His second novel, Sport, was published by Thomas Dunn Books, St. Martin's, and selected for the New York Public Library's Books for the Teenage list. His short stories and essays have appeared in several literary magazines, including the Cincinnati Review, Northwest Review, Kansas Quarterly, and Waterstone. His books, The Girl Who Threw Butterflies and Fits, are for young adults. USA Today said, quote, "The Girl Who Threw Butterflies, a lovely coming-of-age novel seasoned with small doses of Zen, baseball lore, and history." Mick has published essays on Raymond Carver, Bob Dylan, baseball literature, and the art of biography. Currently, he is professor of English and Lowry Writer-in-Residence at Canisius College and lives in Kenmore, New York with his wife and two sons. So welcome, Mick. I'm thrilled to have you here.
It's great to be here, Pat. Every time I listen to you or your show, I feel energized and more creative. So I think this is just what I need on a cold January day.
Now, I'm going to go right out the gate here, Mick. You wrote in an essay called My Bread and Butter, quote, "Maybe I'm nature impaired. Like one of my characters who is a confirmed and unrepentant garbage snatcher, my heart leaps up when I behold a rickety rocking chair, a discarded child's desk. I am fascinated by the homely artifacts of everyday life, by the stories they tell." Now, Mick, will you expand on your nature impairment?
Well, I think we should all be like Mary Oliver and to be able to write beautiful poem after poem about grasshoppers and so on. I grew up in St. Paul and I do like to hike, so I think I'm being a little whimsical there. But I was invited to write an essay about nature. That was the topic. And of course, I thought about nature in the sense of Wordsworth, whose heart leaped up when he beheld I guess. And I do think I find inspiration in ordinary things. In the first chapter of Flesh Wounds, or the second chapter, there's someone who engages in a practice in Buffalo. We call it, I think it's garbage snatching, right? People bring their unwanted items to the curb. And this character loves to rescue things and finds their potential and takes furniture and scours away the layers and layers of paint and finds something beautiful underneath it. And that struck me as a wonderful metaphor, maybe for art, I think, in some kind of way. And I do remember when we were buying a house and you do the so-called walkthrough. Mm-hmm. And you're supposed to look at the floors and the ceilings and the boiler in the basement. And I would be distracted, I guess, like any kind of novelist, by what books do they have? And, why are they selling? Are they getting divorced? They look happy in that Christmas picture. And all the sort of human detail, what I think many of us deal in. So there's all kinds of ways to be inspired, and there's all kinds of stories to tell. And I think of, to get back to Mary Oliver, my office door, I've copied out her instructions for living a life. And she says, pay attention, be astonished, tell about it. There's all kinds of things to pay attention to. You can pay attention to a waterfall, but you can also pay attention to a homeless man on the street. And there's all kinds of ways to pay attention. And
well, that brings me, Mick, to my next question. You write novels, short stories, essays, and poetry. In a sense, you're a little bit like a utility player on a baseball team in that you play many positions. Will you talk about your range of expression and how do you know what form a story should take?
That's a wonderful question. I will cherish the idea of being able to play every position. One of my wonderful colleagues, Eric Answorth, tells our students that writing poetry and fiction is a necessary kind of cross-training, that it uses different muscles. But certainly story is underneath them all. I'm writing more poetry lately, and I'm sort of apologetic and self-effacing about being the Grandpa Moses of poetry, coming to it quite late. And I think my poems are just short stories with line breaks, basically, that there's a narrative element in all of them. I love short stories, maybe most of all. I think life comes to us as short stories, the anecdote, the little nagging incident that we want to tell someone about. I never had a great burning to write a novel, although when I started Flesh Wounds, I thought it was going to be a short story. I wanted it to be a short story, but I had so many characters. It was a 12-page short story with about 12 different characters, and each in their different points of view. And I thought, nope, this story, it's going to take 300 pages to figure out what happens. And I think that ideally, you probably think about this with a painting. The painting tells you what it needs.
Yes.
And how big it needs to be. We go by intuition and just the art of the possible. I don't think I know how to write a screenplay, so nothing will seem like a screenplay to me.
You bring up characters, and let's go with this cast of characters you have. The characters in your books have male protagonists. In Flesh Wounds, Hal is a Minneapolis salesman. In the book Sport, Harlan Sport Hawkins is a kid who loves baseball. In Fitz, it's a 15-year-old boy named Fitzgerald who's estranged from his dad. But in the book, The Girl Who Threw Butterflies, by the way, I read that book and loved it. The book, The Girl Who Threw Butterflies, Molly is a 13-year-old girl who recently lost her dad. By making the lead character female, what were you able to do that you couldn't do if the character were a boy?
Well, that's a good question. In Flesh Wounds, it's sort of a family cast, and Hal, but his wife Phyllis gets several chapters, and their daughter Ellie gets some chapters, and there's a girl named Becky who gets a couple chapters. I guess it allows me to inhabit her and in all kinds of ways. And she, being a girl who happens to love baseball rather than softball, there's a little bit of a kind of daring and sort of crossing boundaries, and she takes some flack for that. And I think when I write about people different from myself, that's one of the real joys of fiction, isn't it? Reading and writing and trying to imagine and understand what it's like to not be you. And I think the breakthrough I had with Molly when I was writing about her is I decided that she loved baseball as much as I did and in the same ways that I did. That wasn't gendered. A love of baseball had nothing to do with gender. And then I could sort of understand her. But I also understood what a bunch of boys on a baseball field spitting and, not being very kind to her might look like from her perspective. So it allowed for her to be almost a little bit of an anthropologist, kind of an outsider, and understand how this works. And I think that was interesting and enjoyable to me.
One of the key aspects of this book, and it was so moving, Molly does not want to be seen as, quote, Miss difficulty overcome. And that really got me thinking about how we label people. If someone gets cancer, it's like we don't see them, we see the cancer. If someone loses a loved one, we see them as defined by the loss. It's as if an event or an illness disappears the person. What are your thoughts about that?
It's a profound idea, isn't it? And so well intentioned. I'm reading a book by Wilfred Sheed, who had polio, and he described his irritation in being characterized as particularly brave or plucky, and just wanted to be a kid. And so to think of praising Molly for being brave or overcoming difficulty is well-meaning, but as you say, it can kind of drain the individuality out, can't it? And so it's an unfortunate kind of story. Or I think you're right that there's a flattening, and I don't think any of us want to be flattened or labeled or characterized, even in a way. And then that's a lot to live up to, isn't it? To be a role model.
When you create your characters, how do you know that they ring true? How do you know?
Well, you put words on the page and then you read the words, and I think it's probably visceral. Does this feel true to our lived experience? Because that's what a reader's going to do, right? When we read a novel, we say, would somebody do that? And I think some of the hallmarks are, at least what I tell my students, are certainly complexity, feeling more than one thing, not being all good or all bad or all anything. So it's probably like when you do a painting, how do you know a tree looks like a tree? You look at what you've drawn, you look out the window at the tree, and are they similar? And obviously it's how that makes you feel as well. So, I remember there was times, I borrow traits from people, but I remember one very consciously writing a character, and I wanted a reader to feel the way I felt when I was around that person. And, that's a challenge. And I didn't feel good around that person. And I wanted the reader to feel that sense of sort of unspoken creepiness or menace that I was picking up. And it's just a matter of finding the right words and craft, but truth to life. So that's the irony of fiction. It's not literally true, but we hope it's true in some large sense.
So what do you think, Mick, this magnificent compulsion, the need to tell stories, what is that about?
It's about being human, isn't it? That a lot of people smarter than I have pointed out that human beings are this storytelling animal, right? That there's communication, dolphins and bees communicate, but I don't think, and trees communicate, I'm reading all this stuff, but I don't think they tell stories. And there's something that just seems wired into us. Kids don't have to take an English class to want to hear a story or to tell us the stories. And we know that stories pre-existed written language, and the Iliad and the Odyssey were stories that were told. And so I think that it's one of the most human things we do is to tell stories. And so that's, why do we breathe? Why do we love?
For those folks who aren't quite sure, how do you know if you have a story to tell?
Well, you do, first of all. And so that's where I would start. But I think it's a real, kind of the question of confidence that you're talking about. And because we may get a mistaken notion of what a story is, that it's got to be larger than life. It's got to be ready for Hollywood. It must involve danger or exotic locales. But that's not true. And so I think when I work with young storytellers, a lot of what I do is simply try to point them in the direction of what's unique and distinctive about their experience. And it might seem quite modest. You think, well, I'm 18 years old. I've never, left the United States. I've never suffered any story. Well, there's things that we know, and it may be in your backyard. It may be in your family. And I think to honor that and to respect our experience and to see that there's something in there is the first step. But there's so many voices. And so much of writing is tricking those voices and telling them to shut up.
You walked right into it, Mick. That brings me to my next question. People who make art, write stories, poems, music, often fight the two-headed dragon, timidity and perfection. By timid, I mean lack of courage, easily frightened. Is my story worth telling? Well, what do I know about writing? And then perfection is a state of no flaws or defects. I don't want to write my story because it won't be perfect. How do we free ourselves from this two-headed dragon?
It's not easy, is it? And it's sad because you think of all the stories that aren't told and all the stories that could go out in the world and do good, both for the teller. And I think stories can be necessary, that people need other people's stories. And the perfection is one that I think many of us struggle with. I cherish, I think, I can't remember, somebody said, I don't get writer's block, I just lower my standards. And I think that quite a bit. We all have these little games. I like to write in a notebook. And so I often, back when you could go to coffee shops, I would go to a coffee shop and get coffee and give me, a notebook out. And I would resolve to write for 30 minutes, which is about how long it takes me to drink a tall cup of coffee. And if I move my hand across the page, words appear. And I've never done that ever without getting something. I'm fishing. I always get a bite. And it might be something unexpected, but nothing comes up if you don't take out the notebook, if pen never touches paper. So there's various tricks. And I mean, that's what college classes and writing classes are good for, any kind of workshop, because you sign up going to a place where somebody's going to ask you to write something, and you're going to write something. And then you've got something to work with, and you get some feedback, and it's not as horrible as you thought it might have been. And then it really begins in the revising, rethinking.
I think as a visual artist, the critical voices that many people who engage in expression, I find after 40 years of making art, I find the bigger the dream for the painting or the bigger the idea, the louder the critical voice. I finally connected that dot. So when we venture into territory and expression, it just seems that, who do you think you are that you're going to write this? Or who do you think you are? You're going to make a painting that's not been done like that before. And I think we all carry some form of critical voice that always seems to be lurking like a vulture around this beautiful creative expression that one is about to really jump into.
Yes, the vultures are always circling.
Yeah.
And we learn strategies, I think, to hold them at bay. When I was working on novels, I wouldn't talk about them very much. I had the unfortunate to think of describing my novel, and it sounded kind of dumb when I described it, and it made me feel discouraged. Yeah. And so I just don't do that. Yep. And I've understood that the novel isn't in the pitch or the 50-word description. It's there. And it also helps if you're blessed with encouraging friends.
Yes.
When I was working on The Girl Who Threw Butterflies, I would send chapter by chapter to my dear friend Ron and his wife, and they would read it and say, "Oh, send us more. What's next?" And they weren't asking about commas or giving me high criticism, but they were assuring me that someone was out there, that there was a story, that they cared, and that meant the world to me to go back and give them a little bit more. So I think that to have the right kind of supportive inner circle is another strategy for keeping those vultures away.
That's a really wonderful point that you bring. When I've taught art students, I always caution them, surround yourself with people who are supportive, who are not negative. And whatever you do, when you start a new idea, hold on to it. Keep it in the privacy of your heart and your mind, because that's a very raw and vulnerable time. When you come up with a new idea, for me personally, the second, if I start talking about it, I can almost see the painting crumble before my eyes. It's DOA, it's done. So I've kind of figured out, Mick, maybe I won't talk about it and let the talking happen on the canvas.
No, that's a magic period, isn't it? I think if you give it a verbal description, it limits it too soon instead of it unfolding. And so there is a kind of mystery about it.
Yeah.
it's private, and there's a kind of period of fermentation.
To me, it's like I grew up Catholic. I'm an Italian Catholic. So if you need to know about any saint anywhere, I can tell you. But to me, this process is almost like transubstantiation. It's that point where an idea goes into the realm of sacred and it just comes to life. And so, as you say, it's great to have people that you know and trust, that you can maybe share an idea once you start it going. And so I think that's something that cuts across all creative activity. And that brings me to telling stories, as you say, as being human. But to tell a story, somehow that means, how honest can I be? Do I want to be this honest? What are your thoughts about that?
You're absolutely right. Intimacy is the sharing of stories, right? The way we get to each other as we tell stories, and there's easy stories to tell, and the way to get someone's attention is to say, well, here's a story I've never told anybody. And there is a kind of vulnerability that comes with that storytelling. Yeah. So absolutely, storytelling is an act of courage. I've thought a lot about stories of recovery and the healing power of stories, how in 12-step programs people tell their stories and what it was like, what happened, and what it's like now, and what a gift that is, but how vulnerable it is to tell a story about your failings, your addictions, harm that you've done to yourself and others. And yet the rewards are just as great in self-knowledge. And the wonderful thing on the other side of that leap of faith that requires so much courage is realizing that this I story is really a we story. That, right? We read a book, we say, well, it's about a 13-year-old girl who's lost her father, but I felt that way sometimes. I know what that's like. Well, because we're human and we have grief and we have love. So the tremendous rewards and kind of liberation that can come from doing that. But you're right, it takes courage and time. And I know I've been asked, sometimes students will say, well, when do you know you're ready to tell a certain story? Like when I had an interesting and painful childhood, and I knew there was a story there, but I didn't really go right as sport is a fictional take on a growing up very similar to my own. But I was in my 30s before I felt like I had a place to stand and the understanding to write about that. So everybody gets to take their time, and there's no obligation to spill our most painful stories if we're not ready to do it. So that's something that needs to be thoughtfully undertaken.
In saying that, our need to communicate creates emotional connections in the form of paintings, music, poetry. Those emotional connections, they go beyond nation, borders, race, gender, and time. You can walk into an art museum, see a painting that's 200 years old, and it's like someone just knocked the emotional wind right out of you. And it's so familiar to your heart. And I think there's something about the heart truth in an art form that when we are honest, it does transcend time. It reaches right across human to human in a profound way. But you're right. It takes time to know when you're ready to be that honest and when you're ready to tell that story.
I love the phrase, the heart truth. And that's exactly what all the arts are after, the literature and poetry. And I think that's the wonderful reward. And, fiction grants at least a kind of a mask or a freedom, or it's sort of you and not you. And I love Bernard Malamud, who's a wonderful American writer. And his advice to her, he said, tell the truth, but with cunning. And I love that little proviso at the end, that it doesn't have to be the whole truth, nothing but the truth, so help you God, that there's a way that one can shape, which is what I guess fiction comes from, the Latin word to shape, and to make something artful and to sneak up on the heart truth in a skillful way.
Yep. Oh, very nice. A story is like a bridge. A bridge is not a bridge until the first person walks across it. A story begins when it's shared. So, Mick Cochrane, you wrote, quote, "The best fiction, the fiction I love to read, the fiction I aspire to write, explores this human landscape, the tumultuous terrain of the heart." To this, I would add, your work is a bridge that carries the reader smack dab into the tumultuous terrain of the heart, but trusting that we have a heart strong enough to carry the weight load. The work you do touches lives, Mick, and thank you. I'd like to thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Pat.
If you enjoyed this podcast, tell your friends and family and subscribe. Bye.